Mark is generally believed to be the most reliable gospel. Mark is supposedly less developed, written first, and the least dependent on other gospels due to it being the earliest. But Mark isn't given this favor because it is held in such a high regard, but instead more because the other gospels are held in such a low one. This causes Mark to float to the top of a relatively shallow barrel, and I think Mark deserves more credit. Like the other Gospels, it's commonly believed to be anonymous, written late, and generally not too reliable from a historical perspective, but I find the reasons levied against its reliability to be unconvincing. We'll start with dating because, quite frankly, there isn't too much to say here, but this isn't because there aren't any arguments in favor of an early dating. But instead, it's due to the fact that many of the arguments I would propose were already made in my original video on authorship and dating. On top of that, since we already argued for a pre-70 dating of the Gospel of Matthew, it naturally follows that Mark was already written prior to 70, since Matthew used Mark when writing his Gospel. But there is one part of the debate around Mark's date that I find very interesting, and that's the fact that most skeptical scholars, and even many conservatives, will date it to around 70. And maybe this doesn't seem all that odd, but remember why most of these scholars think Mark is late in the first place. The primary reason is the destruction of the temple, and when did that happen? AD 70. If Mark is truly this late work, then I think it would make much more sense to push the date even further back to around 75 or 80 at the earliest. Pretty much any other time we know a work is based off of a previous work, or, in this case, an event, scholars usually give it a few years between the dates to allow for the author to become aware of this work or event, so that he could properly incorporate it into the narrative. But it appears that the reason some of the scholars date Mark right at 70 is because they're aware that this is a relatively early document, and 70 is simply the latest they can go. And we even observe some more skeptical scholars like Maurice and James Crossley argue for an earlier dating of at least parts of Mark's Gospel than many conservatives would. So there appears to be a general understanding within New Testament scholarship that Mark is pretty early, and that the destruction of the temple is simply seen as the basis to push the date further back. But what's arguably more important than dating is authorship. Yet I'm not too heavily interested in specific Markan authorship as I am in Petrine influence, although these two do go hand in hand. Now, the early church is unanimous in regards to both Markan authorship and Petrine influence, but before we get into quotes from the church fathers, what is Petrine influence? Well, to put it simply, it's the idea that Mark received his information that he would relay in the Gospel from none other than the Apostle Peter. If we are to believe Mark is reliable, then this connection to Peter is very important. Matthew and John would have been eyewitnesses themselves, and Luke explicitly states that he received his information from eyewitnesses in his prologue. So, unless Mark is based off of the testimony of an eyewitness such as Peter, it can't really be held in as high of a regard as some of the other Gospels, and this really hurts Matthew and Luke because they relied on Mark at times. Now, the first person to make claim that Mark was written by Mark, under the influence of Peter, is Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis, in the early 2nd century, who stated, "Mark became Peter's interpreter, and wrote down accurately, but not in order, all that he had remembered of the things said and done by the Lord. For he had not heard the Lord or been one of his followers, but later, as I said, a follower of Peter. Peter used to teach as the occasion demanded, without giving systematic arrangement to the Lord's sayings, so that Mark did not err in writing down some things just as he recalled them. For he had one overriding purpose, to omit nothing that he heard, and make no false statements in his account." Now, around the mid to late 2nd century, the Anti-Marcionite Prologue states, "Mark, who was called stump-fingered because for the size of the rest of his body he had fingers that were too short, he was Peter's interpreter. After the departure of Peter himself, the same man wrote his Gospel in the regions of Italy." Justin Martyr, writing around the same time, quotes extensively from the Gospel of Mark, and calls Mark the Memoirs of Peter. The rest of these works were composed around the year 180, and starting with Clement of Alexandria, he would go on to state, "When by the Spirit Peter had publicly proclaimed the gospel in Rome, his many hearers urged Mark, as one who had followed him for years, and remembered what was said, to put it into writing." Tertullian states, "While that gospel which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was." And finally, for the early church fathers, Irenaeus of Lyon states, "Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter." Now, there is one other early Christian writing that ties Peter and Mark together, and that's the first letter of Peter, which can be found within the New Testament. Now, even if you don't believe Peter was the author of this epistle, it is undoubtedly an epistle about Peter, and intended to be read as coming from his perspective. And in this letter, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13 states, "She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son." Now, this text may have not been written by Peter and says nothing about the authorship of Mark's Gospel, but it is a first-century Christian document that makes the connection between Peter and Mark, so we know that these early church fathers weren't simply fabricating a relationship between the two within the 2nd century. So, as you can see, there's quite a lot of attestation to Mark and Peter's connection to the Gospel of Mark throughout the early church. But do we find anything that supports this idea within the text itself, like we did with Matthew? Well, to put it simply, yes, and we probably have better internal clues to the authorship of Mark than Matthew, at least in my opinion. But we must also remember that, like Matthew, none of these by themselves are a home run. Instead, what I'm going to do is provide a cumulative case that I believe fits best with the traditional understanding of Mark's Gospel. Now, St. Mark was supposedly a translator, and this corresponds well with the Gospel of Mark. The author appears to be bilingual, as Mark preserves more Aramaic words and formulae in Greek than in any other writing within such a small space. Now, regardless of whether or not the author was bilingual, some skeptics argue that Peter would have likely been bilingual in Greek and Aramaic, and thus not needed a translator or interpreter. Now, what I find funny about this objection is that many other skeptics will point out to Peter's low social status as a Galilean fisherman to argue against him authoring the epistles of Peter, since he would have had very little to no formal education. Now, personally, I actually lean closer to the latter option, although I don't think that debunks Petrine authorship of the epistles, but that's a topic for another day. So because of these facts, I think it's possible that Peter was somewhat bilingual, but it definitely would have helped him to have a translator or interpreter such as Mark with his ministry. So, if it is the case that Mark took what Peter said and then wrote it down in his gospel, we should see examples of this via an insider's perspective. Well, we do, and the primary way of getting this insider's perspective is through a little something called the plural to singular narrative device. This narrative device was first discovered in 1925 by C.H. Turner, and later repopularized and expanded upon by Richard Bauckham in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. This plural to singular narrative device is defined as a passage where a plural verb, without an explicit subject, is used to describe the movement of Jesus and his disciples, followed by a singular verb or pronoun referring to Jesus alone. Now that may sound kind of confusing, so we will go over a few examples to show what I mean. The first instance of the device being used is Mark chapter 1 verse 21, and it reads, "And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching." Now the point of intrigue here is the words they and him, so pay attention to those. What Mark is doing here is basically improper writing. Grammatically speaking, Mark should say something like, "And the disciples went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath Jesus entered the synagogue and was teaching." Now we've changed the words they and him. You see, whenever we talk to someone, it isn't uncommon to frequently use pronouns like he, she, or them without specifying who you're talking about, and this is something we simply do for convenience when talking. But in writing, Mark shouldn't be doing this. Another example is Mark chapter 11 verse 12, which says, "On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry." This is another example of Mark using incorrect grammar that we commonly see in conversations. This is all understandable if we go back and think, hey, Mark is taking the words of Peter, words he would have used when spreading the gospel, debating pagans, arguing with Jews, and was just in general conversation. So writing it down, even if it doesn't make complete grammatical sense, is what Mark did. In fact, if we insert the first person pronouns like we for they, then it becomes more understandable, and we can read this passage of Mark 11:12 as, "On the following day, when we came from Bethany, he was hungry." But lest you think I'm making a mountain out of a molehill from one or two verses where Mark just got sloppy with his grammar, these aren't the only two examples of the plural to singular narrative device. Mark uses it nearly 24 times, 21 to be exact. But what about the parallel passages in Matthew and Luke? Well, out of the 21 Markan uses of the plural to singular narrative device, the Matthean parallel retains it 9 times, while changing it 6 times and having no parallel at all 6 times. Luke strays even further than Matthew, only retaining the plural twice. He does have the same number of changes as Matthew with 6, but even more examples of having just no parallel at all, with 13 of the 21 not being replicated in Luke's Gospel. Now, the plural to singular narrative device may be the most important evidence of Markan authorship coupled with Petrine influence, but it certainly isn't the only thing. Mark has, relative to length, more references to Peter than in any other Gospel. Peter is mentioned once every 432 words in Mark, compared to 1 in 654 in Matthew, and 1 in 670 with Luke. On top of that, Mark bookends the story with Peter. In most Gospels, Peter doesn't appear until a few chapters in. John is an exception, but even then we have to wait until verse 40 for Peter to appear. Mark, on the other hand, mentions Peter by verse 16, and his last reference to him is the second to last verse of his Gospel. In this verse, Mark chapter 16, verse 7, the women are told to tell the disciples about the resurrection, and Peter is especially distinguished. Now, most of these arguments are primarily about Peter, as I had already mentioned, but Mark's defense of Peter can be seen as evidence that the gospel was composed by his spiritual son, as he would have wanted to paint him in a better light. For example, Matthew records when Peter falters after walking on water, and Jesus said that he had little faith, whereas Mark doesn't record this event. In Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11, Luke records Jesus and Peter first meeting each other, where Peter is at first skeptical of Jesus when he tells him to cast his net, and then later Peter tells Jesus to depart from him because he's a sinful man. Whereas in Mark chapter 1, verses 16 to 18, Jesus simply tells Peter to follow him, and he obeys immediately with nothing else being added. In Matthew 15, verses 10 to 18, Jesus asks Peter if he is still without understanding when he fails to understand one of Jesus' teaching on what defiles a man. Whereas Mark chapter 7, verses 14 to 19, records the disciples as a group asking and Jesus responding to them as a group, instead of just Peter looking foolish. And a final example is in the account of the woman with the blood issue. In Mark, when Jesus asks who touched him, Mark again records the disciples as a group responding, this time in a bit of a sarcastic way. But if we read Luke's rendition, then it is Peter who asks the rhetorical question. Now, all this isn't to say that Peter was never portrayed negatively. There is, of course, still his thrice denial of Christ among some other passages. And interestingly, some scholars interpret these as a polemic against Peter. But the problem with such an interpretation, even disregarding everything else we've gone over, is the fact that Mark often draws sympathy for Peter after he errs. Now, there are a few examples of this, but the one we'll go over is Mark chapter 9, verse 6. When Peter suggests building a tent for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, it is said that he spoke up because he was terrified. The fact is that more often than not, Mark is either leaving out embarrassing details about Peter, or at the very least trying to make his audience understand where Peter is coming from. So, in conclusion, Peter's prominence within the Gospel of Mark, coupled with the attestation of the early church and the internal evidences supporting the fact that his gospel information was written off the words of a witness, it is strong evidence that we can trust the Gospel of Mark as being derived from an eyewitness at an early date.